Hello, my name is T.R. Welling, and I would like to introduce you to the Ogle family American trade route. What I'm building is a dynamic video project where individual scenes and individual pictures from each of the towns along the Ogle family American trade route can be included or excluded, as the case may be, depending on what the customer wants to view. Various pictures of Newcastle, Friedrich, the dozen towns in and around Newcastle that the Ogles founded, as well as all the 100, 200, 300, 1,000 towns between Newcastle and Tiffin that I know the Ogles founded. The 1,000 to 2,000, 10,000 towns between Tiffin and Chicago that I also know that the Ogles founded. Having individual slides, individual pictures, possibly some, if they're the correct video ratio, of course, having video shot of those towns in those towns sent to me so that I can include them in this video series online, so therefore the audience can choose what they want to see and what they do not want to see. Whichever descendant of the Ogles was at the land belonged to the Ogle family. By name, it would have belonged to whoever was there at that specific generation, but land was passed from father to son and from son to son to son along a heretical line. That's how property was passed between families. Or it was passed to a daughter who then the husband owned it, and then it passed from the husband to the firstborn son to son to son to son. The Ogle family American trade route, since there was previous existing trade routes that the Ogles had worked with in Europe, that they also took advantage of in the New World by pulling mercenaries, soldiers, and settlers from France, Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland, England into the New World, specifically in droves French. The Ogle family from Northumberland came to America, first to Boston and then to Newcastle, and from Newcastle they established a trade route from Newcastle to Chicago and then down to St. Louis, most likely down to New Orleans, but that part has not been proven. They were in Newcastle, they were in Chicago, and they were in St. Louis. The Ogles, having been religiously and politically persecuted, had to leave the UK in order to be able to continue existing. So when they left the UK, they went to Ireland, they went to Germany, they went to Normandy, they went to France, they went to Scandinavia, and some of them went to the New World. The New World, they first settled in Boston, what would become Boston, before the English took the city. After Boston, they moved down to Newcastle, and with a little bit of influx of information from New York, since there was a Ogle on board the ships of the line that conquered New Amsterdam, turning it into New York. That Ogle was a man by the name of John Ogle. Was born in Northumberland, and then came to New York, and then eventually died in Newcastle, in the land of his ancestors had already established Newcastle several decades before his arrival. The Ogles of Delaware, the Ogles, after being pushed out of Boston and out of Northumberland in the UK, figured out very, very quickly that they're going to be kicked out of Newcastle also. So the Ogles then made a deal with the French government, the German government, and reluctantly the English government, and started making a trade route between Newcastle through Chicago down to St. Louis, establishing property, being granted property. Along the way, they established boundaries of land that they were later able to claim as theirs, since the kings of France then chartered that land to the Ogle family. A few miles away, a few miles north of the Ogle trade route that was in existence, that was documented, because the Ogles lived and existed in Tiffin, Ohio, and several other cities on a east-west axis from Tiffin, Ohio. There's a dozen towns in Upper Ohio that the Ogles founded, and Detroit is only a few miles north of Tiffin. The city of Chicago claims Joseph Ogle as being one of its founders, even though he was in the area 100 years before Chicago was recognized as the English as being founded. Well, all the towns that were supposedly founded in 1820 had already been in existence for either years, decades, or even 100 years, possibly even more, because they were chartered under the French government. And when both New France, that was east of the Mississippi, was given over to the English, and the west of the Mississippi, being the Louisiana Purchase, was given over to the Americans, both the east and west portions of the Mississippi were named different things. The west side was named Louisiana, and the east side was named Upper France. Upper France or New France. Several different names have been associated. The settlements of France, New France, in the Americas, was where things were chartered from, and towns were established under the purview of the French kings, not the English. So when the English and then the Americans took New France, Upper Louisiana, from the kings of France, either by purchase and or by combat, and established themselves, they had to reestablish and re-grant incorporation to all the towns that were previously France. Which is the reason why the overwhelming majority of the Ogle American trade route was erased, is because 90% of it was in New France. You cannot have 90% of a trade route in New France and have the English government be okay with that. So nationalistic pride, the English and then the Americans, were then forced to erase the first 100 years of Chicago history. They were forced to erase the previous 1,000 years of St. Louis history, even though the previous 1,000 years of St. Louis history was not entirely all white folk, because the white settlers in the area, starting with the Ogles, were arriving to a city that had been partially decimated through wars and a variety of other things, but it was a city of a couple 100,000. Previous to 100 years before Columbus, the city was a thriving 2, 3, 4, 500,000 person population. All that infrastructure was still in place, although 100 years of decay existed. Now, St. Louis was not the capital. The capital was that across the river, across the Mississippi, the first city, the first capital of Illinois. Although that city had existed for hundreds of years through French settlers. And the French settlers arrived because they had sponsorship by the Ogle trade route. The Ogle family had been sponsoring come one, come all to New France, to Upper Louisiana, to Louisiana, come one, come all. We have a navy so we can get you here, and we have a civilization, a cultural infrastructure. So we have houses, we have cleared farm fields, we have everything you need in order to be able to just get here and start working hard, making a living for yourself. And you don't have to live under the oppressive thumb of the French kings. You just have to live under our very, very nice thumb, which may or may not have been accurate. After all, 100 years later, that 1 to 200 years later, depending on where you're at, in St. Louis, southwest Illinois, when it was finally incorporated into America in the 1805, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that situation, the Ogle family was erased. So it's entirely possible that the inhabitants of Upper Louisiana, New France, were not exactly happy about the rule of the Ogle family portrayed in that area, and therefore customarily erased their presence and erased the evidence of the Ogle family American trade route. They took advantage of the trade route, but they then erased who gave it to them. Now, the Ogles, this is not the first trade route that they had established between Newcastle, Chicago, possibly Detroit, down to St. Louis, and then possibly down to New Orleans. New Orleans and Detroit at this point have no evidence, but I have only started the process to look at the reams of data to find if there was Ogles in the area or not. Also, the French have a great deal of records which may or may not include the Ogle family in France. And since it was all Louisiana, Upper Louisiana, and or New France, that whole situation means that going to France and looking up from 1495 up to and through 1830, some of those records were destroyed during the Revolution, because part of the reason why the French people were so angry is because of the harsh treatment in both France and the harsh sometimes press gang way that settlers were picked from France and sent to the New World. Press gang means that the troops come into your area, and at point of bayonet you're told to either get on a ship or pack a small bag and get on a ship, or you may be able to pack up most of your belongings and then get onto a ship at the point of a bayonet, and then that ship leaves and you may or may not know where you're going based on if the soldiers and or the commander and or the ship's captain tells you where you're going. You may or may not find out until you hit the land, and then depending on how many people are there before you or what's there before you, you may or may not still know where you're at. So press gang existed, is real, happened, but it was not exactly a nice thing to do. There's some evidence that it happened in France. There's a mountain of evidence that press ganging happened to all shapes and sizes. All but upper royalty were press ganged at various times in the last 1,000 years. Now, in Europe, the evidence of the trade route that existed before the American trade route was in Northumberland. The second that the Picts had conquered Northumberland in circa 780 AD, when that occurred, well, the mercenaries just kept coming because they had been coming for, by that time, around 800 years. So there was come one, come all for 800 years, means that whatever ships the individuals had, or whatever ships the Ogle family could send and then bring back troops, there was a constant flow of troops into Northumberland, which is one of the reasons why the Northumberland royal family were able to beat back the Roman Empire for 400 years, having almost constant skirmishes back and forth over Hadrian's Wall, which is the proof that the Romans were stopped dead at Hadrian's Wall, which is unprecedented in the entire history of the Roman Empire, that they were defeated time after time, after square after square after square, for 400 years, from Julius Caesar's invasion of the UK up till the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Romans were defeated at Hadrian's Wall at every step. Now, there was a lot of give and take. They would send 6 or 10 or 15, 20, 30 squares up into Hadrian's Wall and take Northumberland for a few days, few weeks, few months, even a few years, until the Newmarks arrived, and then the Ogle royal family would then take the Newmarks mercenaries, train them, and then attack the Romans and beat them back over the wall. Occasionally the Ogles would then cross the wall and then attack down, pushing the Romans back down as far as sometimes York, sometimes even down as far as the Mercia lands. Very rarely, for a very short amount of time, did the Ogles push the Romans all the way down to London, but it may have happened once or twice. The Romans, of course, are not going to brag about the fact that they were pushed backwards by several hundred miles back to London, but it is entirely possible that it happened because they had such a huge supply of mercenaries from Germany, from France, from Scandinavia, from Norway. Anywhere where their Ogles can pull troops from, they pull troops, and were constantly beating the Romans. Only army in history that was able to beat the Romans, other than at the very end when they were conquered a few times by the Germans. The Goths and the Huns were both from Germany. So German soldiers are really, really good at beating the Romans. They demonstrated this, as a matter of fact, at Hadrian's Wall, and they demonstrated this, as a matter of fact, 3 times by sacking Rome itself. The Germans were the ones that entered Rome at least twice and left purposefully. Give us a whole bunch of gold and we'll leave. The Germans that sacked actually sat in the Senate itself for a number of days, weeks, months, what have you. Had no interest in keeping the city. They just wanted to beat the enemy, and they did. So there's evidence of how tough and rough the German mercenaries were that were being used by the Ogle royal family to beat back and keep the land of Northumberland for the Ogle royal family. So when the Ogles were in America, the Ogles knew exactly how to pull mercenaries and pull settlers and pull what was needed from France, from Germany, from the UK, from Ireland, from Scotland, from the Scandinavian areas. They knew how to do it because they'd done it between the Romans, 400 years, and the Northumberland royal family, between 400 and 800, were undefeated by the Picts, except for just a handful of battles and the last conquest. But it took the Picts accessing with the 2 or 3 of the Scottish armies, their own army, the Welsh army, the Mercia army, and the Cornish army, 7, 8 armies against the Northumberland, the Ogle royal family, to force the Ogles to leave the UK. And they left the UK and went to Normandy. And they were in Normandy for about 200 years, and then they came back with another German army, because the Ogle royal family in history begins with de Ogle and his son Humphreys de Ogle and his son de Ogle. Those 3 men were present at Hastings. Immediately after the battles were ended, William the Conqueror gave, by handwritten document, Northumberland back to the Ogle royal family, proving the word back indicates a solid evidence that the Ogles had Northumberland before 750. The word Cole, as in the Old King Cole, shows that the Ogle royal family were in charge and strong and big and heavy duty during Constantine's time and Constantine's father's time, because Constantine himself, his mother, was Helen. Helen, her last name was Ogle, because her father was King Cole. Not the King Cole of the nursery rhyme several hundred years later, but the Ogle royal family. The Ogle royal family used the word Coel as the name for king.